I want you to close your eyes for a second and just picture a city in Europe around 1850.
Okay.
Let's say Manchester, or maybe Berlin. Physically, the world has just completely transformed in the span of one generation.
Yeah, totally unrecognizable.
Yeah, you've got these massive soot-stained factories basically blocking out the sun. You have cities that are absolutely swelling with people. I mean, folks who were literally farmers 30 years ago are now crammed into these tight tenements.
And the air just smells like coal and sulfur.
Exactly. The Industrial Revolution has basically rewritten the hardware of human civilization.
It really was a visual shock. I mean, if you were time traveled there today, it would look like this modern industrial dystopia.
Mm-hmm.
But here is the problem we are tackling today.
Right.
While the physical world had upgraded to, let's call it version 2.0,
Mm-hmm.
the software, the government, the laws, the whole social contract that was still running on version 1.0.
It had totally crashed.
Exactly.
You have this modern economy, but a political system that was basically designed for lords and peasants.
Yes. And that tension, that specific friction between a brand new industrial reality and an old aristocratic government, that is what defines the late 19th century.
Which is why we're doing a deep dive into how society finally hit the reboot button. We're looking at a really fascinating stack of source material today, specifically some AP European history notes on topic 6.8.
Right, the section covering mass politics and social reform.
Right. And the mission here is to trace how we went from a world where the government was basically just a bodyguard for the rich to a world where the state actually started to care about the average person.
We're talking about the invention of voting rights, labor unions, feminism.
And the welfare state.
It is the shift from the state as the protector of property to the state as the provider of welfare. And spoiler alert, they didn't make that shift because they suddenly wanted to be nice.
No.
They did it because they were terrified.
That is the key theme to keep in mind, right?
Mm.
Fear as a motivator for progress. So let's unpack this. The first big change in our source notes is this concept of mass politics. Because the word politics in, say, 1840 didn't mean what we think it means today.
Not at all. If you look at the early 1800s, political parties like the Whigs or Tories in England, they weren't these big machines with bumper stickers and massive rallies.
No.
They were elite cliques. It was literally a bunch of wealthy landowners meeting in private clubs, drinking brandy, and just deciding the fate of the entire nation.
Basically, if you didn't own a massive estate, you didn't exist politically.
You were a subject, you were not a citizen. But as the century grinds on, you get this massive, undeniable pressure to expand the vote, to expand suffrage.
Yeah.
So slowly, property requirements are lowered, and suddenly you have millions of working-class men who can actually vote.
Which completely breaks the private club model.
Completely shatters it.
Right, because if I'm a politician now, I can't just schmooze my rich friends anymore. I have to actually convince the guy working 14 hours in the textile mill to cast a ballot for me.
And that requires a totally new strategy. You need a slogan. You need a platform. You need a real party organization. This is the birth of the modern political campaign as we know it.
Wow.
And the absolute best place to see this play out is in Great Britain with the Liberal Party.
The Liberals are so interesting here because historically they were the party of business owners, right? Like the new money.
Right. They believed in free trade, small government, basically just leave us alone to make money.
Yeah.
Well, by the late 1800s, they had a huge problem. They needed to win elections against conservatives, but the new voters, the factory workers, they didn't care about free trade.
No, they cared about not starving.
Exactly. So the Liberals had to pivot.
A hard pivot.
A very hard pivot. Under leaders like David Lloyd George, the Liberal Party started championing things that would have sounded completely insane to them just 20 years earlier.
We're talking national education.
Public health benefits.
Unemployment insurance.
It's almost like they realized, hey, if we want to stay in power, we have to actually make these people's lives better.
It was transactional.
Highly transactional. They essentially bought loyalty with social reform. But the thing is, it worked. It created the early framework of the British welfare state.
Now, while the British were doing this sort of polite, incremental dance in Parliament, the notes show that Germany was dealing with something much, much more intense.
Germany's where the stakes get really high. In Britain, you had established parties pivoting, but in Germany, you had the rise of the SPD.
Social Democratic Party.
Right. And this wasn't a gentleman's club adapting to the times. This was a massive grassroots movement built by workers, for workers, and based explicitly on the writings of Karl Marx.
So these guys aren't looking for like a slightly better tax rate. They're looking for a revolution.
Well, that's the central conflict, and it is honestly one of the most important intellectual battles in modern history. The SPD had this massive identity crisis, which is known as the split between revolution and revisionism.
This is the stuff involving Edward Bernstein, right?
Yes, exactly. So on one side, you have the orthodox Marxists. They are reading Das Kapital like it's a religious text.
Yeah.
They believe that capitalism is inherently unstable, inherently exploitative, and it just cannot be fixed.
Right.
Therefore, any attempt to improve it is a complete waste of time. You just have to wait for it to collapse and then violently seize power.
Basically burn it down.
Burn it down.
Yeah.
But then you have Edward Bernstein and the revisionists. And they looked around at Germany in, say, 1890 and said, hey, wait a minute. Capitalism isn't collapsing.
The numbers didn't match the theory.
Right. Actually, the middle class is getting bigger. Wages are slowly but steadily going up.
So the Marxist prophecy just wasn't coming true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Bernstein argued for revisionism. He basically said, look, we have the vote now. We have a parliament, the Reichstag. Why are we waiting around for some bloody revolution that might never actually happen?
Right.
Let's use the democratic system to pass laws right now.
It's the argument for evolution over revolution. Let's update the software instead of just smashing the entire computer.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the fascinating thing is that the revisionists won that argument. The SPD became the largest party in Germany by 1912.
Wow.
And they pushed for shorter work days, better safety standards, pensions. They proved that you could use the bourgeois machinery of government to achieve socialist goals.
And just for context, the notes mention we see similar mass party structures emerging in other places too, right? Like France and the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party.
Yes, this wasn't just happening in a vacuum. It was a European-wide awakening.
It feels like such a pivotal moment in Germany, though, because if the revisionists lose that argument, maybe the 20th century looks very different. Maybe you get a Bolshevik-style revolution right in the middle of Berlin.
It's entirely possible. That revisionist victory is really what gave us the modern European model of social democracy. You know, a capitalist economy, but with a very strong, robust safety net.
Okay, so that's the ballot box. That's one lever of power. You vote for the guy who promises to fix the safety rails. But the working class had another lever, didn't they?
They did.
One that was a lot more direct.
The power of the strike. This brings us to Section 2 in our source stack, labor unions.
It's funny because today we think of unions and politics as being joined at the hip. But in the 19th century, the union movement feels much more raw. It was basically a street fight.
It was literally a fight. You have to remember, for a long, long time, unions were outright illegal.
Right.
The Combination Acts in Britain made it a literal crime to organize. But once the right to strike is finally legalized in the 1870s, the floodgates just open.
And the notes highlight two specific strikes that really changed the game. And the first one is just, it's cinematic. The Match Girl strike of 1888.
The Match Girls. Yes, this is a story everyone should know. We aren't talking about big, burly dock workers here. We are talking about young women, many of them just teenagers, working in match factories in London's East End.
And the conditions they were facing were just absolute nightmare fuel.
Horrific.
Yeah.
They worked 14-hour days for absolute pennies, and they were constantly exposed to white phosphorus, which caused an occupational disease called phossy jaw. The toxic fumes literally ate away the bone of the jaw. It was highly disfiguring and very often fatal.
And these girls, who were arguably the most powerless, marginalized people in the entire British Empire, they just decided they'd had enough.
They walked out. And what's really crucial here is how they handled it. They didn't just stop working. They actually went to the press.
They ran a PR campaign.
They won the public relations war. It was a total David versus Goliath moment. They publicly shamed the employers into improving conditions.
Which is incredible. It proved that even the most vulnerable workers had real power if they stuck together.
Exactly. And then just a year later, in 1889, you see that exact same power scaled up massively with the London dock workers' strike.
This was the one that basically shut down the empire, right?
Pretty much. The dockers paralyzed the biggest trade hub of the world. Ships were just sitting there in the Thames, unloaded. Food was rotting on the docks. It demonstrated a very cold, hard fact to the elites. Without the workers, capital is useless. The rich could own all the ships they wanted, but they couldn't physically unload them.
It's pure leverage.
Pure leverage.
And looking at the numbers in the notes, this movement just exploded. By World War I, there was something like 3 to 4 million unionized workers in Britain alone.
It was a literal army. And as they grew, they realized something really important. Striking is great for fixing wages today. But if you want to change the laws for tomorrow, you need to be in the room where the laws are actually written.
Right, the strike only gets you so far.
Exactly. This is where the unions and the political parties finally merge. In Britain, the unions didn't just want to support the liberals forever. They eventually said, you know what, we need our own guys in Parliament.
So they formed the Labour Party.
Yes, a party created by the unions, specifically for the working class.
So now the hardware of society is finally getting some upgraded software. You have mass voting, you have mass strikes, but there is a massive group of people we haven't even touched on yet. Half the population, in fact.
The women.
Yeah. This is Section 3, deeds, not words. And I think a lot of people just sort of assume the feminist movement popped up out of nowhere in the 1910s with the votes for women's sashes.
Right.
But the sources show it goes way back.
Much further back. You really have to remember the context of the era. All through the 19th century, you have these liberal, enlightened guys giving grand speeches about individual rights and liberty.
And the women are sitting there asking, does that apply to us?
And the legal answer was a very firm no.
Because of coverture.
Right, the legal doctrine of coverture. Basically, a woman's legal rights were entirely subsumed by her husband the moment she got married.
Wow.
She couldn't own property, she couldn't keep her own wages, she had basically no independent legal identity. In the eyes of the law, she was essentially a child.
So the first phase in this feminist movement wasn't even about voting, it was just about basic personhood.
Exactly. You have figures like Barbara Smith Bodichon and a group called the Ladies of Langham Place.
Okay.
And they fought specifically for the right to own property. Their argument was very practical. If
Yeah.
I work and earn money, my husband shouldn't be legally allowed to just take it and drink it away.
Right. And then you have someone like Flora Tristan in France, who I found fascinating, because she's really connecting the dots between the workers we just talked about and the women.
Flora Tristan is incredible. She is basically the grandmother of intersectionality.
Yeah.
She was a French utopian socialist who went around telling male union workers, look, you cannot be free if your wives are slaves.
She linked the two struggles.
Yes. She argued that the oppression of women and the oppression of the working class were fundamentally the exact same fight against elite control.
That is such a sophisticated argument for the 1840s.
It really was ahead of its time. But despite the logic, the legal progress was just agonizingly slow. The men in power simply weren't listening. And that intense frustration is what leads to a massive shift in tactics.
Enter the militants. Emmeline Pankhurst.
Yes, Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU.
Right.
We're in the early 20th century now.
Yeah.
And their motto was deeds, not words. They looked at decades of polite petitions and said, this isn't working. We need to physically force them to listen.
And when we say militant, we aren't using that word like...
Not at all. We are talking about organized campaigns of smashing shop windows, arson, blowing up mailboxes, chaining themselves to the actual gates of Parliament.
And the Hyde Park rally in 1908, right?
Yes, a massive, massive demonstration that led to heavy police retaliation and widespread jailings. And when these women were arrested, they went on hunger strikes in prison.
Which led to force feeding.
Right, the government had to force feed them, which was essentially a form of brutal torture.
It was basically guerrilla warfare against their own state.
It really was. Their core strategy was to make the cost of denying them the vote higher than the cost of just granting it. They demanded to be unignorable.
And did it work?
It definitely forced the issue. It kept suffrage on the front page of every newspaper. The ultimate victory, at least the first major one, came in 1918 in Britain with the Representation of the People Act.
But even then, and this is such a classic political compromise, that it was only partial.
Exactly. Under that 1918 law, men could vote at 21. But women, you had to be over 30, and you still had to meet certain property qualifications.
So it was basically the government saying, we'll let you in, but only the responsible older ones.
Right. It was deeply unequal, but it was the decisive breach in the dam. Once that legal wall was broken, full equality was really just a matter of time.
Okay, so we've covered the ballot box, we've covered the labor strike, and we've covered militant protests. All of these movements are fundamentally about power. They are marginalized groups saying, give us our share. But the notes show there's one more layer to this whole reform cake, and it's a bit different. It doesn't actually come from radicals or union bosses. It comes from the church.
Section 4, the moral crusade.
Yeah.
And this is really important to understand because not every single reform in the 19th century was driven purely by economic self-interest.
Right.
A lot of it was driven by deep religious conscience and humanitarianism.
The notes specifically mention the Sunday school movement. Now, I have to be honest, when I hear Sunday school, I usually think of little kids coloring pictures of Noah's Ark.
Right.
It doesn't exactly scream social revolution to me.
That's totally the modern view. But if you rewind to 1840, Sunday school was a genuinely radical institution. You have to remember, there was no public education system back then.
Oh, true.
Working-class kids were in the textile mills or the mines 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. Sunday was literally the only day they weren't doing manual labor.
So these religious groups weren't just taking that time to teach scripture.
No, they were teaching basic literacy, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And it was mostly female volunteers doing the teaching.
Wow.
They were inadvertently arming the entire working class with the most dangerous weapon you can give them,
Yeah.
the ability to read.
That is a huge insight because you can't have a mass political party or a highly organized trade union if your members can't even read the pamphlet.
Precisely. The Sunday school movement effectively created the literate base that made all that mass politics we talked about earlier actually possible.
That makes so much sense. And then, of course, you have the other massive moral fight of the era, abolitionists.
The abolitionist movement, led by figures like William Wilberforce in Britain. This crusade basically sets the template for every single global human rights campaign that follows it.
Yeah.
They frame slavery not just as bad economics, but as a literal sin, a deep moral stain on the national soul.
And the British Empire officially abolished slavery in 1838.
And they did it at a massive, massive financial cost. That's the key takeaway here. The government paid out millions to compensate slave owners, which obviously is highly problematic in its own right.
Right.
But the broader point is that public moral pressure actually forced the state to act against its own immediate economic interests. That was a huge shift.
And that moral lens started getting applied to other social issues, too. The source material mentions the temperance movement, which linked alcohol to domestic violence and poverty.
Yes.
But it also introduces someone named Josephine Butler, who fought some very specific laws.
Josephine Butler is an absolute hero of this era. She launched a massive crusade against laws that were designed to control public health, but did so by unfairly targeting vulnerable, marginalized women.
Just women.
Just women. It was a total, blatant double standard. Police could arrest any woman they merely suspected of sex work and subject her to horrific, invasive treatment, while the men involved were completely ignored by the law. Josephine Butler framed this not as a public health necessity, but as a severe human rights violation. She argued that these women weren't criminals to be punished, but victims of profound economic inequality and male exploitation.
That is a massive shift in perspective for the 1860s.
It really was. She forced polite society to look at these marginalized women and actually see human beings with civil rights. It was a fierce battle for the dignity of the absolute most vulnerable people in society.
So when we step back for a second and look at this whole big picture, we've got mass politics, labor unions, feminism, moral reform. What's the ultimate synthesis here? Because from the outside, it feels like a really chaotic, messy time.
It was incredibly chaotic. But there is a very clear overarching direction. The 19th century was the era where the average person finally forced their way into the room where decisions are made.
We started the century with a government that was essentially a private club for the landed elite.
Right. And we ended the century with a government that was, frankly, terrified of its own people.
Yeah.
And honestly, that fear is healthy. It meant the state finally had to become a provider of welfare. It had to build schools, inspect the factories, ensure some level of public health, and actually listen to the voters.
Because if it didn't,
If they didn't, the alternative was exactly what those hardline Marxists were promising. Revolution, blood in the streets, the barricades.
which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. The 19th century reformers, specifically those revisionists we talked about in the German SPD, they made a massive bet.
They did.
They bet that working within a deeply broken system, using the slow, boring, frustrating levers of voting and negotiating, would ultimately yield better results than just burning the whole thing down.
And if you look at the standard of living and the social safety nets in Europe today, you could argue that bet largely paid off. They built the modern welfare state without utterly destroying society in the process.
But here's the question. Does that logic still hold true today? When we look at our own modern crises, climate change, massive wealth inequality, political polarization, we hear that exact same debate resurfacing. People are asking, is the system just too broken to fix? Or do we just need to organize better and vote harder?
It's the eternal political question. Do you patch the software, Or do you reformat the entire hard drive?
The revisionists proved you could patch it, but it literally took 50 years of grinding, painful pressure. The real question is, do we have that kind of patience today?
That is the million-dollar question.
Something to chew on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the roots of modern reform.
See you next time.